My name is Elena Whitfield, and I was 26 the night my adoptive parents handed me a folder across a white tablecloth and told me I was never really theirs. My mother said it like she was reading a weather report. My father wouldn't look up from his plate. What they didn't know, what neither of them could have possibly guessed, was that I had already met my birth family 8 months earlier, and that I had quietly booked them a table at the very same restaurant, 20 feet behind my mother's left shoulder. She just hadn't turned around yet. By the time she did, the whole shape of my life had already changed, and I want to tell you exactly how. Welcome to Slow Burn Stories, where we tell the quiet kind of true-to-life drama, the kind that isn't about screaming matches, but about the moment somebody finally stops shrinking themselves to fit into a family that never made room for them. If you've ever had to prove you belonged somewhere you were born into, stay with me. This one's for you. Drop a comment when you get to the end, and don't forget to subscribe. The restaurant was called Hartwell and Vine, an upscale little place tucked into the historic district of Asheville, North Carolina. All exposed brick and low amber light, the kind of place that smelled like rosemary and good wine the second you walked in. I'd never been taken there before in my life. My mother chose it, which should have told me everything, because Constance Whitfield did not spend money on ambiance for my benefit without an angle attached to it somewhere. She wore the navy silk blouse she saved for client dinners and funerals, the one piece of clothing in her closet that meant this matters. Behave accordingly. My father, Graham, had made the reservation under her name instead of mine, which I only noticed because the hostess asked which Whitfield the table was for, and he answered before I could open my mouth. There was no candle stuck in anything, no banner, no mention of the word birthday anywhere on the table. For a dinner that was supposedly about turning 26, the table was strangely bare, and the air between my parents had that careful, rehearsed politeness people wear right before they read you a verdict. I'd spent 4 years of my career sitting across tables exactly like this one. I worked as a claims investigator for a regional title insurance company, which meant I spent my days untangling property records, easements, and inheritance disputes. The quiet paperwork that decides who actually owns what long after a family has stopped agreeing on anything. I knew the difference between a dinner and a deposition, and that night had the temperature of a deposition. So I did what I always do when a room goes cold on me. I clocked the exits, and in doing that, I noticed something small, a brass table marker sitting on the host stand as we walked in, the number 14, attached to a reservation slip with a name on it I'd written myself 3 weeks earlier. I held that number in my mind the way you hold a landmark before you know you'll need to find your way back to it. I set my own folder down beside my water glass. Thin, manila, unremarkable. My mother glanced at it and assumed, I think, that it was a printout of some kind of card. She had absolutely no idea what was inside. To understand why I wasn't surprised by any of what came next, you have to understand what birthdays looked like in the Whitfield house. When I was small, my birthday was a single grocery store cupcake my mother bought on the drive home from work and left sweating on the kitchen counter while she took a phone call. Meanwhile, 3 weeks later, my cousin Colton would get a backyard carnival complete with a rented popcorn machine and a hired magician, because Colton was my Aunt Marisol's son, and Colton was blood. I remember asking, the year I turned 8, if I could maybe have a few friends over too. My aunt was at the kitchen table drinking my mother's wine, and she answered before my mother could. "We can really only do one big thing a year for everybody, sweetheart," she said, kind as anything. That was the part that taught me the most, how gentle people can sound while they're quietly explaining your size to you. So I learned the math early. A child who asks for less costs less. By 9, I'd stopped asking for parties altogether, because I could see it made the arithmetic easier on everyone, and being easy felt like the only currency I actually had in that house. I didn't think of it as sad. I told myself it was efficient. That's the thing about growing up useful. You don't notice you've been priced until somebody finally reads the number out loud to your face. And across that white tablecloth at Hartwell and Vine, 26 years old, I could feel my mother getting ready to do exactly that. I left that house the week I turned 18 with one suitcase and a community college acceptance letter I'd filled out by myself at the public library, because we didn't have a working printer at home that year, or so I was told. Nobody drove me to orientation. I worked the overnight shift at a 24-hour pharmacy and took morning classes, then transferred to the state university and finished a paralegal certificate before pivoting into claims work, where the pay was steadier. I want to be clear that I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because it matters for what happens later. Nobody handed me a single thing. By 26, I was good at my job. Genuinely good. I spent my days inside the bones of other people's property disputes. Easements, liens, the fine print buried in deeds that decides who actually keeps the house when a family falls apart. I could read a property record the way some people read a face. And the cruel little joke of my life, the one I didn't laugh at for a long time, was this. I could untangle a stranger's inheritance dispute in an afternoon, but I could not, for the life of me, get my own family to want me in a room. The one person who ever made me feel otherwise was my grandmother, Opal Whitfield, my father's mother, and the only adult in that whole family who treated me like a person instead of a line item on somebody's budget. She had opinions about everything and apologies for nothing. When I was 12 and crying in her kitchen because Colton had told me I wasn't a real Whitfield, she put down her dish towel, took my chin in her hand, and said the sentence I carried for the next 14 years. "You were chosen, Elena, not collected." Then she made me grilled cheese and let me stay up too late watching old movies with her. Opal died when I was 24. I gave the only eulogy at that funeral that talked about who she actually was instead of what she'd left behind. And within 2 months of burying her, my parents quietly sold their cramped townhouse and moved into the larger property out on Birchfield Lane, the one that had belonged to Opal for 30 years, the one tied to her name in ways I wouldn't fully understand until much later. I didn't think much of the move at the time. I was grieving. But there was a thing Opal said to me on one of our last Sunday phone calls, her voice thin and tired, that I filed away without understanding. "You'll never have to ask anybody for your own life, Elena." I made sure of that. I thought she meant it as encouragement, a grandmother telling a granddaughter to be strong. It would be almost 2 years before I learned she'd meant it literally, in writing, notarized. The year before that dinner, my family started going quiet around me, and not the comfortable kind of quiet. Texts that used to come back within the hour started taking 3 days. My mother stopped looping me into the holiday planning thread, then acted surprised when I showed up to Thanksgiving without a side dish nobody had told me to bring. My Aunt Marisol, meanwhile, got louder. She started using a word in the family group chat she'd never bothered with before. Blood. As in, this is a blood-only weekend at the lake house. As in, the cabin only sleeps 8, so we're keeping it to blood this year, you understand? I understood. I just didn't yet have the paperwork to explain why the temperature had dropped so suddenly, all at once, in the same season. People drift, sure. Families go quiet sometimes for no reason at all. But this wasn't drift. This was coordinated. And the investigator in me kept flagging it the way you'd notice 3 unrelated claims hit your desk on the same Tuesday, and realize slowly that they aren't unrelated at all. So when my phone lit up one evening in late winter with my mother's name attached to a voice 3 degrees warmer than it had been all year, I didn't feel flattered. I felt a small, cold click, like a lock turning somewhere I couldn't see. "Honey," she said, and she only ever called me honey when she wanted something. "We'd like to take you out properly for your birthday this year, the way we never quite managed before." And every instinct 4 years of reading other people's disasters had built in me said the same thing. This is too neat. Here's what most people get wrong about my mother. They assume the cruelty in a person like Constance is loud. It isn't. The cruelty is in the planning. The cruelty is a woman who never once managed a birthday candle suddenly booking a corner table at the nicest restaurant in town and calling it celebrating you properly. When Constance got generous, it was because some private spreadsheet had told her the generosity would pay for itself. I'd watched it my whole life. I'd just never been the line item before. So I said yes, sweetly, the way she'd trained me to. Then I hung up the phone and sat at my kitchen table for a long time, doing what I do. I thought about the move to Birchfield Lane. I thought about the word blood showing up in the group chat at exactly this time of year. And I thought about a sentence my grandmother had said to me before she died, and about the manila folder already sitting in my work bag, the one I'd put together 8 months earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with my mother and everything to do with finally learning where I actually came from. To explain what was in that folder, I need to take you back 8 months, to the week 2 letters arrived and rearranged the entire architecture of my life. After Opal died, I finally registered with the state's Voluntary Adoption Reunion Registry, half certain nothing would ever come of it. 6 weeks later, a letter showed up in handwriting I didn't recognize, careful and looping, the hand of someone who'd clearly drafted it more than once before sending it. It was from a woman named Renata Voss. She wrote that she'd been 19 when she placed me for adoption, that it hadn't been a choice she'd wanted to make, and that she had thought of me every spring for 26 years. She said if I ever wanted to meet her, she'd drive any distance, on any day, with absolutely no expectations attached. She signed her name, and then underneath it, she'd added one more line that I read so many times the paper went soft at the fold. I never stopped saving you a seat. The second letter arrived 4 days later, and at first I thought it had nothing to do with Renata at all. My company had recently been retained to help settle a dispute connected to my own grandmother's estate. A coincidence so strange my supervisor actually laughed when she handed me the file and told me to recuse myself from it. I didn't recuse myself fast enough. Before I handed it off, I'd already seen the distribution schedule attached to something called the Opal R. Whitfield Family Trust, executed 3 years before her death, administered not by my parents, but by a corporate trustee at a bank 2 counties over. Caregiver distributions to Graham and Constance Whitfield, it read, shall terminate upon the beneficiary's 26th birthday, whereupon the remainder, including a 40% ownership interest in Whitfield Family Vineyards, shall pass to my granddaughter, Elena. Not their estate. Hers. Held by a trustee they couldn't touch. Scheduled to leave their hands forever on almost the exact week they'd chosen for that dinner. 2 letters in 1 week. One told me where I came from. The other told me, in my grandmother's own notarized hand, exactly what my parents were about to lose, and why they were suddenly in such a hurry to get ahead of it. I didn't call my mother and scream the discovery down the phone. That's not the weapon I trust, and it's not the weapon that wins. I've watched too many families lose everything to a satisfying outburst that a lawyer later turns into evidence against them. What I had was process, so I used process. I called Priya Anand first, an estate attorney I'd worked alongside on 2 prior claims cases, someone with 0 personal connection to my family, sharp as a blade and twice as patient. I paid her out of my own savings to confirm what I already suspected. The caregiver distributions were real, ongoing, and ending. My parents had been drawing a monthly stipend from Opal's trust for the better part of 2 decades, on top of living rent-free in a house the same trust technically still owned. The remainder, the vineyard shares, would pass to me by the trust's own terms, through a corporate trustee, regardless of anything my parents tried to file against their own will. The second person I called was a woman named Dee Okafor, my closest friend at the office, who'd been nudging me toward the reunion registry for 2 years before I finally did it. Dee didn't have legal advice to offer. What she had was steadier, somehow. She just sat with me on my back porch the night I told her everything, and when I finished, she said, "Okay, so what do you actually want to happen at that dinner?" Nobody had asked me that yet, not even myself. I told Priya I wanted 3 documents in a folder, and that was all. A retainer letter, so my parents would know I had counsel the moment they tried anything. the trust's distribution schedule, so they'd see the date in black and white, and my original birth certificate, with Renata Voss's name sitting where my mother had always assumed her own belonged. I labeled the tab, closed the folder, and carried it in my bag for 8 months, like a quiet engine I hadn't turned on yet. The dinner invitation only told me when to turn the key. I met Renata for the first time at a diner exactly halfway between our two towns, because she said she didn't want me to have to drive too far on my own. That small consideration undid me more than any speech could have. She was nervous in a way that made her hands restless. She'd brought a worn photo album that she kept opening and closing without quite showing me, like she wasn't sure yet that she'd earned the right. She had my exact chin, and the same habit I have of going quiet when I feel something too large to say out loud. Over the following months, we built something carefully, the way you'd repair a bridge while you're still standing on it. I learned I had a half-brother, Theo, 19, all elbows and bad jokes, who started sending me memes within a week of meeting me, like I'd always been there to receive them. I learned my birth grandmother was a small, fierce woman named Bertie, who took one look at me at our first dinner together and said, "Well, there she is." Like I'd simply been running late, not gone for 26 years. They never once asked me for anything. That was the part my nervous system genuinely couldn't process. No favors, no money, no role to perform in exchange for their attention. Renata told me, the third time we met, the sentence that became the truest line of my life. "We kept a seat for you, sweetheart. We never gave it to anybody else." And I, a woman who could draft a flawless inheritance clause for a total stranger and explain exactly what they were owed, sat in a vinyl diner booth and didn't know what to do with my own hands, because for the first time in my life, I was wanted by people who got absolutely nothing out of wanting me. There's a difference between being needed and being wanted, and until that year, I'd only ever known the first one. Being needed is a job. You show up, you produce, you stay easy, and in exchange, you get to keep your seat another season. I'd mistaken the steadiness of that arrangement for love the way you can mistake a long commute for a destination, just because you make the same drive every single day. What Renata and Theo and Bertie offered me had no job attached to it, and honestly, that terrified me more than my mother ever had. The first time Renata called just to ask how my week had gone, with absolutely no agenda underneath the question, I had to pull my car over halfway through the conversation because I couldn't see the road anymore. I tested them in small, ungenerous ways I'm not proud of. I'd cancel plans at the last minute, half hoping to see if they'd punish me for it. They never did. "No worries, sweetheart. Next time," Renata would say, and mean it completely. I tried to pay for everything when we went out, desperate to make myself useful, to earn the seat the way I'd earned every seat in my life so far. Bertie finally took my face in both hands, the exact way my grandmother Opal used to, and said, "You don't have to buy your way in here. We already paid." And slowly, against 26 years of evidence, a knot I'd been carrying since I was 9 started, not to vanish, but to loosen. There was one more piece of the puzzle I didn't expect, and it came from my father, of all people, 3 weeks before the dinner. I'd driven out to the house on Birchfield Lane to drop off some paperwork for Priya, and I found Graham alone in the garage, sorting through a box of Opal's old things my mother had clearly told him to get rid of months earlier, and that he'd clearly been avoiding. He looked startled to see me, almost guilty, the way you look when someone catches you doing the one honest thing you do in private. Tucked inside that box was a stack of canceled checks, decades old, made out monthly to a name I didn't recognize at the time, Renata Voss, for what the memo line simply called support. My father had been quietly sending money to my birth mother for years after I was placed, on top of whatever the adoption agency had arranged, without ever once telling my mother, without ever once telling me. When I asked him about it, right there in the garage with sawdust in the air and a single bare bulb swinging overhead, he didn't deny it. He just sat down on an overturned bucket and said very quietly, Your mother didn't want her getting comfortable enough to ever come asking for you. I didn't think that was right, so I sent what I could without her knowing. It didn't excuse the dinner that was coming. It didn't excuse 26 years of one candle and a calculator. But it complicated him in a way I wasn't prepared for, and I carried that complication into the restaurant with me, even though I never let it show on my face. So when my mother called to invite me to celebrate 26 properly, I already knew exactly where I wanted to spend that evening. I just decided I'd spend it everywhere at once. I called Renata first and asked her a question I'd been too afraid to ask anyone in my entire life. Would you come to my birthday dinner? I explained the whole shape of it. My parents, my suspicions, the trust, the speech I could feel building on the horizon. I told her I didn't know exactly what they were planning to say, only that I didn't want to be alone in the room when they said it, and that I no longer had any interest in performing the grief they were clearly expecting from me. Renata didn't hesitate for even a second. What time, and should we dress up? Then, after a pause, she added the line that made me put a hand over my mouth in my kitchen. We'd be honored to watch you not need them. So I made one more call, this one to Hartwell and Vine, and I booked a second table for that same evening, under my own name, Elena Whitfield, party of 3. Table 14, the host told me, near the back, roughly 20 feet behind the reservation, already on the books for a Whitfield party of 4 at the front. I almost laughed at the geometry of it. My parents had no idea they'd be staging my disownment within direct sight of the family that had spent 8 months saving me a chair. Back at the front table in the present, my mother decided the silence had gone on long enough. She praised the wine list to fill the air. My father told a parking story he'd already told in the car, and then somewhere between the bread basket and the entrees nobody would end up touching, Constance folded her hands and shifted into the voice. I know that voice. It's the one she uses when she returns a gift in front of me and explains gently why it had never been practical to begin with. We've always tried to do right by you, she began. Graham nodded along, half a second behind her, the way he always did. We gave you a roof, an education, more than plenty of children ever get. I let her talk. I rested one hand flat on the manila folder beside my plate, and I watched my father's eyes flick down to it and away. The tab had a typed label, and the top edge was visible above my fingers. He could see maybe 4 letters of it if he tried. He tried. My mother kept going about sacrifice, about how a child should understand the cost of being raised, and I thought about a sweating cupcake and a single candle, and I said nothing at all. Then she paused, took a small, careful sip of wine, set the glass down with the precision of a woman reaching a line she'd rehearsed, and said the sentence that opened the door to everything. There's something you should have been told a long time ago, Elena. You're adopted. We adopted you as an infant. You were never biologically ours. She watched my face while she said it. She was waiting for the collapse. This was the moment she'd built the entire evening around. The corner table, the navy silk, the rehearsed pauses, all of it engineered to land here. On the second her adopted daughter learned she'd been a stranger all along and shattered into pieces my mother could sweep up and walk away from. I'd love to tell you it didn't land at all. It landed. Some part of a person always braces for the floor to give way, and mine had just been told there was no floor underneath me. But I'd had 8 months to learn this already, and the only thing my mother actually revealed that night was how little she knew about who I'd become. She leaned in, almost gentle, and delivered the line I will hear in waiting rooms and quiet kitchens for the rest of my life. We only kept you because of the support payments. Honestly, Elena, you were never anything more than that to us. She smiled when she said it. That smile was the detail that finally freed me. Not the cruelty itself, I'd been raised on the cruelty. The smile. A woman doesn't smile delivering the worst sentence of your life unless she's rehearsed it enough times to actually enjoy the choreography of saying it. And in that smile, I saw the entire shape of my childhood rearrange itself into its true equation. I hadn't been a disappointing daughter. I'd been an asset that had finished depreciating. My father, to his lasting discredit, tried to explain the rest of it like an accountant defending a tax position. There was an agency stipend in the early years, Graham said, not meeting my eyes. That ran out a long time ago when you were still in elementary school. After that, it was mostly about your grandmother. She had certain expectations about family, and raising you helped us meet those expectations. It was worthwhile for a good many years. Worthwhile. As though I were a rental property with a depreciation curve instead of a person who used to fall asleep in his lap during long car rides. I sat very still and let the arithmetic of my entire childhood rearrange itself into its true shape. The one candle, the hand-me-downs from Colton that still had Marisol's store tags on them, the way the heat got turned down in my room first every winter. They hadn't been poor. They'd simply been pocketing the difference between what a child costs and what a child generates, and I had been the generator. What comes after it ends today, my mother said, cutting back in, impatient with my father's bookkeeping, is that there's simply nothing further that keeping you close does for us. You're 26 now. There's nothing left to invest in. She said it almost regretfully, the way you'd note that a coupon had finally expired. I reached for my water glass. My hand did not shake. I noticed that it didn't, and I filed that small fact away like a quiet gift. Then my father did the thing he'd actually come to do. He reached into the leather portfolio he'd brought, the one I'd assumed held a card, and slid a thin sheaf of papers across the tablecloth until it touched my plate. "We've already filed," he said, to formalize things. "You won't be named in either of our wills. We wanted to do this cleanly, in person, so there'd be no confusion later." He'd rehearsed cleanly. I could hear the lawyer who'd coached him into the word. And here is the part I have never been able to make my family understand, the part that turned the whole evening without my having to raise my voice. I read the caption on the first page in about 4 seconds, the way I'd read 1,000 filings exactly like it for clients who'd come to me devastated and confused. And I saw immediately what my parents had actually done. They had filed against the wrong instrument entirely. They'd spent good money cutting me out of an estate that was nearly beside the point, while leaving completely untouched the document that actually decided everything. They genuinely believed the power in that room ran through their own modest wills, so that's where they'd aimed their expensive little knife. I didn't correct them. You don't tell the other side they've sued the wrong defendant. You let them finish. I slid the papers an inch back toward the center of the table, neither accepting nor refusing, and I let them keep believing they'd already won. That's when my Aunt Marisol's voice arrived on speakerphone from inside my mother's purse, because of course Marisol had been listening on the line the whole time, because Marisol had quietly helped architect half of this. "Blood looks after blood, Elena," she said, warm as a knife dipped in soup. "You've always understood that." There it was again, that word, the one she'd been seeding in the family group chat for an entire year, finally spoken out loud at the table it had been built for. I looked at the phone, at my aunt, who had once answered for my mother the day I turned 8, and explained to a child why she wasn't worth a party, and I felt the very last thread of obligation in me go slack. These were not people I was losing tonight. These were people I was finally setting down. I'd carried them a long way, much longer than they'd ever earned, and my arms were finally gloriously tired. I considered everything I could possibly say, the whole flood of it, 26 years backed up behind one small dam. And then my mother made the mistake people like her always make. She filled the silence with the line that had worked once, expecting it to work twice. "We only kept you for the support money," she repeated, slower this time, leaning into every word, trying to draw the blood she could see hadn't come the first time. But a sentence loses its teeth the second time you hear it from the same mouth. The first time, it had been a revelation. The second time, it was just a confession. And it wasn't a confession about me at all. It told me everything about her, and nothing about my worth. I set my napkin in my lap, smoothed it once, and let her watch me not break. Behind her, at table 14, I saw a woman with my exact chin turn her head toward our table and go very still. That was when my Aunt Marisol arrived in person, with my cousin Colton trailing behind her, both of them performing the most unconvincing surprise I'd ever seen from people who'd clearly been waiting in the bar for a text. "Elena? What a coincidence," Marisol said, pressing a cold cheek against mine. I understood instantly that my mother had called in reinforcements. Constance liked an audience for her best work, and she especially liked one that would nod along and apply pressure if I got difficult. Marisol pulled up a chair without being asked. Colton, 27 and still dressed like his mother bought every stitch he wore, gave me the same look he'd been giving me since we were children, the look that says you were always going to end up at the kids' table eventually. "We just want what's best for the family," Marisol said, laying a manicured hand over my mother's. "And families have to make hard choices about who's really part of them. You've always been such a practical girl, Elena. Surely you understand." I looked at my aunt, and for the first time, the word blood did absolutely nothing to me. I'd carried it like a debt for years. Sitting there, I finally understood it had never been mine to pay. And then, while Marisol was mid-sentence about the family's wishes, my father leaned toward me and said something low, just for me, almost too quiet to catch over the noise of the restaurant. "Your grandmother loved you," Graham said. He stopped there. For a moment I saw the whole other version of him, the man he might have been if he'd ever once chosen the harder right thing over the easier comfortable one. His eyes were wet. He'd loved his mother. That much I knew was true, and some part of him clearly understood now that the woman he'd loved had built a wall around me with her own money precisely because she hadn't trusted her own son to do it himself. I waited. There was a version of that night where my father said the next sentence, the apology, the "I'm sorry, this is wrong, I won't do this." I would have heard it, and it would have mattered. But he looked at my mother, who was watching him the way a handler watches a dog that's wandered too close to traffic, and I saw him choose. He sat back, he picked up his water glass, and the almost sentence died in his throat, the same place so many of his almost sentences had died over the years. That was the closest thing to love anyone at that front table offered me all night. 4 words and a swallow. I didn't hate him for it. You can't hate a man for being exactly the weight you've always known him to be. But I finally understood why they'd filed in such a hurry, why this whole rushed, cruel evening existed at all. He knew about Opal's trust. He'd known the date was coming, and he had hoped, quietly, desperately, to get my signature on something before I ever found out what his own mother had done for me. So I asked him a question, not loudly, not as a daughter. I asked it in the voice I use at work when I've found the flaw in someone's filing, and I'm giving them the dignity of noticing it themselves. "Dad, which instrument did you actually file against? Your estate or Grandma's trust?" The table went quiet in a brand new way. My mother's wine glass paused on its way to her mouth. Marisol's manicured hand stopped mid-pat. My father blinked at me like I'd started speaking a language he half recognized from somewhere he'd never actually visited. Because in 11 words I'd told them 3 things they hadn't budgeted for. That I knew there was a difference. That I knew which one mattered. That I'd known long enough to learn the vocabulary cold. "What are you talking about?" my mother said, and it came out smaller than she meant it to. I let the question sit. I've learned the most powerful thing in any room is the person who doesn't need to rush toward the answer. I turned my water glass a quarter turn on the cloth, lined it up with the edge of the folder, and looked at my father, who had gone very pale and was silently begging me with his eyes not to open it. Then I opened it. There was no flourish, no slammed papers, no raised voice. I simply turned the folder to face them and laid the 3 pages out side by side on the white cloth, the way I'd lay exhibits in front of a client who needed to finally understand their own situation. The retainer letter first, with Priya's firm letterhead and the unmistakable line confirming I was represented by counsel. The trust's distribution schedule second, the relevant paragraph already underlined in black ink. And third, my original birth certificate, with Renata Voss's name sitting exactly where my mother had always assumed her own belonged. I didn't point at anything. I let the paper do the work. Paper does. My mother's eyes went straight to the trust schedule, because of course they did, because some animal part of her had always known exactly where the real money slept. I watched her read it. I watched the words land. Caregiver distributions to Graham and Constance Whitfield shall terminate upon the beneficiary's 26th birthday, whereupon the remainder, including a 40% ownership interest in Whitfield family vineyards, shall pass to my granddaughter, Elena. I watched her reach the word remainder and then my name, and I watched the color drain out of her face from the top down, like a window shade being slowly pulled. "Mom," I said gently, because I could finally afford to be gentle. "You filed against the wrong family. The one you cut me out of tonight was always the smaller one." My mother is a fast woman, I'll give her that. Even cornered, it took her about 10 seconds to assemble the full picture, and I watched her do it in real time. The house on Birchfield Lane, funded by a trust she'd assumed she'd live inside forever. The monthly distributions that had quietly furnished her entire comfortable life and that ended, by their own terms, tonight. The vineyard shares, the real value, the part she'd spent 2 decades adjacent to and never once controlled, passing on this exact date to the daughter she'd just finished telling she was finished with. And the waiver she'd brought, the one folded neatly inside that leather portfolio, the one I'd been seconds from signing before I knew any of this, that would have been worth precisely nothing, because it released a claim against an estate that had never been where the actual value lived. She'd aimed every weapon she owned at a will and missed the trust entirely. The cruelty had been free. The mistake had been extremely expensive. And here is the last thing my mother had to teach me. People like her rarely apologize the moment they're caught. They pivot. Her face rearranged itself, the cold draining out, a terrible warmth flooding in. She reached across the table for my hand. "Elena," she said, her voice suddenly soft and wet and maternal in a way it had never once been when it cost her anything, "we're still your parents. Whatever's in those papers, that doesn't change what we are. We're family." The word family, from the same mouth that had said, "You were never anything more than that to us," 20 minutes earlier. I looked at her hand reaching for mine, and I did not take it. The exact sentence that had been her weapon was now, in this new light, the confession that finally cleared me to leave. "I want to tell you the truth about power, because I handle it professionally for a living. The strongest position in any room isn't the one holding the biggest number. It's the one that doesn't actually need the number at all. I had a career I'd built entirely with my own hands. I had savings I'd earned working overnight pharmacy shifts and drafting other people's documents. I did not need the vineyard shares to be free. And that, more than any dollar figure printed on any page, was the thing my mother could not survive understanding. So I closed the folder. I gathered the 3 pages back into it, unhurried. I set the pen they'd brought for my surrender down neatly beside her plate. I'd won the thing they thought we were fighting over before any of them ever sat down. There was nothing left to argue. There was only the choice of where I wanted to spend the rest of my birthday. And I'd made that choice 8 months earlier, in a vinyl diner booth, when a nervous woman with my chin slid a worn photo album across the table and asked me for absolutely nothing in return. I stood up. I did it the way you'd rise from any table. No drama, just a woman pushing her chair back and reaching for her folder. The effect on the front table was immediate. "Sit down," my mother said, and the soft maternal mask slipped. the old cold control snapping back into her voice like a bone resetting. "Sit down, Elena. Where on earth do you think you're going?" Marisol straightened. Colton, for once, stopped smirking. My father just looked tired, the look of a man watching the only good thing his own mother ever did walk out of his reach forever. I picked up the folder and held it against my chest, and I looked at my mother, who had spent 26 years trying to convince me I had no real place anywhere, and I told her exactly where I was going. "My birth family is sitting 20 feet behind you." I didn't say it cruelly. I didn't need to. The sentence had been true for the entire meal, true while she smiled and rehearsed and slid her waiver across the cloth. She had believed she was performing my disownment for an audience of strangers. She hadn't been performing it for strangers. She'd been performing it within arm's reach of the people who had been saving me a chair since before she ever decided I'd stopped being useful. I watched my words travel across the table and land. I watched my mother begin, very slowly, to turn around in her seat. She turned the way you turn when some part of you already knows and is begging the rest of you to be wrong. The navy silk shoulders rotated, her chin came around, and there at table 14, 20 feet back, beneath the warm, low light, were Renata and Bertie and Theo, who had been there the entire time, who had ordered quietly and barely touched their food, who had watched my mother deliver the worst sentences of my life and kept their seats and their composure because I'd asked them to let me come to them. Renata met my mother's eyes first. She didn't glare. She didn't gloat. She simply looked at the woman who had raised her daughter on one candle and a spreadsheet, and then she looked at me, and her whole face opened up like a window in spring. Bertie, small and fierce, already had her napkin folded by her plate, ready. Theo had stopped pretending to look at his phone. My mother's gaze went from Renata's chin to mine and back again, doing the resemblance math in real time, and I saw the exact moment she understood that the family she'd just told me I didn't have was sitting 15 feet behind her, in real chairs, at a real table, having watched her do the one thing she could never take back, in front of witnesses she hadn't known existed. She turned back to me. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. For the first time in my entire life, my mother had no script. In the silence where her next cruel line should have been, a chair scraped back at table 14. They stood up, all three of them, not to make a scene, not to confront anyone, just to be on their feet when I crossed the room toward them, the way you'd stand for someone arriving at a gate after a very long flight. Bertie stood first, because Bertie does everything first. Then Renata. Then Theo, banging his knee on the table leg in his hurry. They didn't say a single word to my parents. They didn't have to. Their standing said the entire thing. The restaurant had gone quiet around us, the particular hush of strangers who can feel something true happening and have stopped pretending not to watch. A waiter froze mid-step with a tray balanced on one palm. I walked past my mother, who was still turned half around in her chair, past Marisol, whose mouth had finally run out of the word blood, past my father, who lifted his eyes to me as I passed, and then dropped them again, choosing comfort one final time, 20 feet, 3 tables, 26 years. When I reached them, Bertie took my face in both her hands, exactly the way Opal used to, and Renata pulled out the empty 4th chair beside her own, the chair they'd asked the host to set even though their reservation had only ever been for 3 days, and she said the words she'd written under her name in that very first letter, the words that had gone soft from my reading them over and over. "We saved you a seat," she said. "We always did." And I sat down in it. In the seat that had been waiting my whole life, at the table that had wanted me before it ever knew if I'd come. That was when my mother lost the one thing she had never lost in front of strangers, her composure. I heard her chair scrape. I heard her stand. I heard the calm front table performance she'd worn all evening crack straight down the middle. "After everything we paid for," she said, And it wasn't quiet anymore. It carried clean across the dining room. "After everything we did for you, you do this to us in public? You humiliate your own family over money?" Heads turned openly now. A man at the bar set down his drink. Marisol was tugging at my mother's sleeve, hissing, "Constance, sit down. People are looking." But my mother was past the reach of her own handler for the first time in her life, because the script was gone, and all that was left was the truth coming out sideways. "We gave you everything," she said to a room full of strangers. I noticed she said gave, not loved. Even now, even cornered, the word love wouldn't come, because it had never once been in the inventory. I stayed seated at table 14. I didn't stand to match her. I didn't raise my voice to meet hers. Renata's hand found mine under the table, and I simply held it and let my mother be loud, because the loudness was doing my work for me. Every person in that restaurant was watching a calm young woman seated quietly among people who clearly adored her, beside a furious older woman shouting about everything she'd paid for. There is not a single human being alive who hears a parent screaming about money and thinks, "Ah, there's the real family." My father never stood at all. He just put his face in both hands. I let her run out of words the way a storm runs out of rain. When the quiet finally came back, I did one last thing before I gave the rest of my attention to my actual family. I stood, walked the 3 tables back to the front, and set a single page down on the white cloth in front of her, the trust's distribution schedule. I left it face up. "You can keep this copy," I said. "You'll want to understand exactly what ended tonight and what didn't." She stared at the page. My father reached for it, then didn't. I looked at the two of them, my mother, who had priced me at 1 candle, and my father, who had loved his own mother too much to ever honor what she'd actually asked of him, and I said the only sentence I'd prepared in advance, the one I'd written in my head in the parking lot and decided I'd only use if I'd earned it. "You kept me for the support payments," I said. "They kept a seat for me." Then I turned around and walked back to table 14, and I did not look behind me again. Not when Marisol called my name. Not when my mother said something I couldn't hear and had no interest in hearing. I sat back down beside Renata. Bertie had ordered me a slice of chocolate cake while I was gone, and Theo had stuck a single lit candle into it. For 1 second, the symmetry of that caught in my throat. Then Renata leaned over and said, "Blow it out, sweetheart. Make a wish." And I realized I didn't have one left to make. I already had it, sitting right there beside me. The trust did exactly what my grandmother built it to do. On my 26th birthday, the caregiver distributions to Graham and Constance Whitfield ended, on the date and by the terms Opal had notarized 3 years before her death. The remainder, the vineyard shares, passed to me through the corporate trustee, completely untouched by either of the wills my parents had spent good money revising, because you cannot disinherit someone from a trust you were never given control over in the first place. The waiver, unsigned, was worth exactly what it had always been worth. Within a year, my parents sold the house on Birchfield Lane, since without the distributions, they couldn't carry it, and moved into something considerably smaller. I'm told Marisol was furious to learn that none of Opal's money would ever flow toward Colton after all. The story of that dinner traveled, the way these stories do, through the family first, and then well past it. The version where Constance Whitfield is the devoted mother, wronged by an ungrateful adopted daughter, never quite caught on, because too many strangers at Hartwell and Vine had watched a woman scream about everything she'd paid for, while a quiet woman across the room held hands with the family that hadn't paid for anything at all. I didn't sue anyone. I didn't post a single word about it online. I simply stopped answering and let the silence be the boundary, because that's the only kind that ever actually holds. My father texted me once a few weeks later. 3 words. "I am sorry." No name signed. No follow-up. I never replied. I heard later, through Theo of all people, who'd somehow ended up friendly with a cousin on my adoptive side, that when Marisol tried to rally the rest of the family to contest Opal's trust, it was my father who quietly shut the whole effort down, told them his mother had every right to leave her own money exactly where she pleased, that it was hers, that the matter was finished. He was right. He was also, as ever, about a year too late, saying it to the wrong room, when it cost him absolutely nothing and changed absolutely nothing. That was the whole of Graham Whitfield in the end. A man who knew the right thing, even felt it somewhere underneath all that careful comfort, and could only ever bring himself to say it once doing so, had stopped requiring anything of him. I didn't need the apology, but I'll admit I was glad, in a small, clean way, that he'd finally said something true out loud, even if it arrived years too late to matter. As for the rest of it, I used part of my share of the vineyard to keep it running rather than selling it off, with Theo, of all people, now working harvest seasons there alongside Bertie, who has strong opinions about pruning that nobody dares argue with. Renata and I talk every Sunday now, at 4 o'clock, the hour I used to save for Opal. Theo still sends memes, usually at the worst possible moments. And somewhere in a drawer at my new family's kitchen table, there's a photo album that doesn't quite close anymore, because it finally has enough pages in it. Being useful was all my adoptive parents ever wanted from me. Being wanted was the one thing I'd never actually had until I went looking for it myself. It took me 26 years and one terrible dinner to finally understand that anyone who only keeps you around for what you produce has already told you, in the plainest language there is, that they were never truly your family at all. That's my story. One candle for 25 years. And on the 26th, a whole table that lit them all without my ever having to ask. If someone in your life only seems to value you when you're useful to them, take this as your sign to stop auditioning for a seat you already deserve. You don't have to earn the people who actually love you. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment below, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.